Cold open, Pukimachin, stepping into the world of 1914. The air is thick with the hum of progressities are alive with electric lights. The latest fashions parade down bustling boulevards, and the promise of a new era seems to hang over every conversation. Trains thunder across continents, telephones connect voices across oceans, and the world's most powerful nations are locked in a race to outdo each other in art, science, and technology. Newspapers boast about the wonders of modern life, and for many, it feels like nothing could possibly go wrong. This is the height of civilization, or so everyone believes. But beneath the polished surface, something far more dangerous is brewing. The great empires of Europe, Britain, France, Germany, Austria-Hungary, and Russia are locked in a silent competition, each one desperate to prove its dominance. Old grudges simmer just below the surface. France still aches for the provinces it lost to Germany decades earlier, while Germany, newly united and hungry for power, is building a navy that threatens to eclipse even Britain's legendary fleet. Austria-Hungary, a patchwork of restless nationalities, is struggling to keep its empire from tearing itself apart. And in the shadows, secret alliances and whispered promises are tying the fate of one nation to another, creating a web so tangled that a single spark could set the whole thing ablaze. Yet, if you asked the average citizen on the street, war would seem like a distant memory, something for history books, not for the modern world. People are more interested in the latest inventions, the newest styles, and the next big social event. The idea that Europe could be plunged into chaos by a single event seems almost unthinkable. After all, haven't we moved past the days of senseless bloodshed? Haven't we learned from the mistakes of the past? But history has a way of sneaking up on even the most confident societies. In the salons of Paris, the coffee houses of Vienna, and the smoky clubs of London, politicians and generals are making plans, some in the open, many behind closed doors. Rumors swirl about secret pacts and military buildups, but most people dismiss them as just another round of political posturing. The world feels stable, even as it teeters on the edge of disaster. And then, in a city most Europeans couldn't find on a map, a single gunshot shatters the illusion. The world of 1914, so proud of its progress and sophistication, is about to be dragged into a conflict more brutal and devastating than anyone could have imagined. The question isn't just how it happened, but how no one saw it coming. But the real story of how the world unraveled is even more shocking than you might think. Tensions boiling over to understand how the world of 1914 could so quickly unravel. You have to look beneath the glittering surface and see the cracks that were already spreading through Europe's foundations. The continent was a patchwork of rivalries, old wounds, and new ambitions, each one quietly fueling the next. It wasn't just about armies and borders, it was about pride, revenge, and the desperate need to prove who really ruled the modern world. France, for example, had never forgiven Germany for the humiliating defeat it suffered in the Franco-Prussian War decades earlier. The loss of Alsace and Lorraine wasn't just a matter of territory, it was a scar on the national psyche, a constant reminder that France had been bested by its upstart neighbor. Every schoolchild learned about the lost provinces, and every politician knew that reclaiming them would be the ultimate symbol of French revival. Meanwhile, Germany, newly unified and bursting with energy, was determined to show the world that it belonged at the very top. The German Empire was young, ambitious, and eager to expand its influence, not just in Europe, but across the globe. But Germany's rise was making other powers nervous, especially Britain. For centuries, the British had ruled the waves, their navy the envy and terror of the world. But now, Germany was pouring resources into building a fleet that could challenge British supremacy. The two nations found themselves locked in a naval arms race, each launching bigger and more advanced battleships, each convinced that the other was plotting to tip the balance of power. The newspapers called it the dreadnought race, and it was more than just a contest of steel, it was a battle for the future. Austria-Hungary, meanwhile, was a crumbling empire held together by little more than tradition and force. Inside its borders lived dozens of different nationalities: Serbs, Croats, Czechs, Slovaks, Bosnians, and more, many of whom dreamed of independence. Nationalist movements were gaining strength, and the empire's leaders were growing increasingly paranoid about losing control. Russia, always eager to play the protector of Slavic peoples, was quietly encouraging these movements, hoping to weaken Austria-Hungary and expand its own influence in the Balkans. And then there were the alliances, those secret, tangled agreements that promised mutual defense. but also guaranteed that any small conflict could spiral into a continent-wide disaster. Germany and Austria-Hungary had pledged to stand together, while France and Russia had their own pact. Britain, wary of getting dragged into continental squabbles, had signed a looser agreement with France, but no one was quite sure how far it would go if war broke out. These alliances were supposed to keep the peace by making war too risky for anyone to start. In reality, they turned Europe into a powder keg, where a single spark could set off an unstoppable chain reaction. But the tension wasn't just between governments. Ordinary people were swept up in a wave of nationalism, convinced that their country was destined for greatness, or at least, that it couldn't afford to fall behind. Newspapers fanned the flames, publishing stories about enemy plots and military preparations. In the cafes of Paris, the beer halls of Berlin, and the markets of St. Petersburg, people argued about who was to blame for the rising tensions, each side certain that the other was the real aggressor. And all the while, military technology was advancing at a dizzying pace. New rifles, machine guns, and artillery promised to make the next war faster and more decisive than any before. Generals drew up plans for lightning attacks and rapid mobilizations, convinced that they could win a future conflict in weeks, not years. But no one seemed to realize just how deadly these new weapons would make the battlefield, or how quickly the old rules of war would be swept away. Europe, in 1914, was a continent on edge, its leaders playing a dangerous game of brinkmanship, its people caught between pride and fear. The world looked stable, but beneath the surface, the pressure was building. And as the summer wore on, it was only a matter of time before something or someone would push it over the edge. But no one could have predicted just how sudden and how tragic that spark would be. The spark assassination in Sarajevo on a warm June morning in 1914. The city of Sarajevo was buzzing with anticipation. Archduke Franz Ferdinand, heir to the Austro-Hungarian throne, was visiting with his wife, Sophie. For the empire's rulers, this was meant to be a show of unity and strength, a chance to remind the restless provinces that Vienna was still in charge. But for many Serbs and Bosnians living under Austro-Hungarian rule, the Archduke's presence was a bitter reminder of lost freedom and foreign domination. Tensions simmered just beneath the surface, and not everyone in the crowd was there to cheer. What happened next would echo through history. The Archduke's motorcade rolled through the city in a parade of open-top cars, the route published in advance for all to see. It was a decision that, in hindsight, seems almost reckless. Lurking along the streets were members of a secretive group known as the Black Hundung Nationalists, determined to strike a blow for Serbian independence. Armed with pistols and homemade bombs, they waited for their moment. The first attempt came quickly. As the Archduke's car approached, one of the conspirators hurled a grenade, but the bomb bounced off the folded-down roof and exploded beneath the car behind, injuring several officers but leaving Franz Ferdinand and Sophie unharmed. In the chaos, the would-be assassins scattered, some swallowed up by the crowd, others slipping away into the city's winding streets. For a brief moment, it seemed the worst had been avoided. The Archduke was shaken, but alive. The authorities urged him to leave Sarajevo immediately, to abandon the rest of his visit and return to safety. But fate, or perhaps stubbornness, had other plans. Instead of fleeing, Franz Ferdinand insisted on visiting the wounded officers in the hospital. The motorcade set off again, but this time, confusion reigned. The driver, unfamiliar with the city, took a wrong turn and found himself face to face with Gavrilo Princip, one of the failed assassins, who just happened to be standing outside a cafe, still reeling from the morning's chaos. In a moment that would change the world, Princip stepped forward, drew his pistol, and fired 2 shots. The Archduke and his wife were both fatally wounded. Within minutes, the heir to the Austro-Hungarian throne was dead, and the world would never be the same. The news raced across Europe like wildfire. In Vienna, shock quickly turned to fury. The Austro-Hungarian government was convinced that the assassination was more than just the act of a lone fanatic. Rumors swirled that the Serbian government had secretly supported the plot, providing weapons and encouragement to the conspirators. Some historians still debate how much the Serbian authorities actually knew, but at the time, suspicion was enough. The empire's leaders saw an opportunity not just for justice, but for revenge. Across the continent, the assassination sent governments scrambling. In Berlin, the German Kaiser offered Austria-Hungary a so-called blank check of support, promising to back whatever action they chose to take. In St. Petersburg, Russian officials watched nervously, aware that any move against Serbia would force them to respond. France and Britain, bound by their own alliances and wary of being drawn into a conflict, began to prepare for the worst. The press seized on every rumor, every whisper of conspiracy, turning the assassination into a symbol of the dangers lurking in the shadows of Europe. But for ordinary people, the meaning of Sarajevo was less clear. Some saw it as a tragedy, others as a warning. Many simply couldn't believe that the death of a single man could threaten the peace of an entire continent. Yet, as the days passed and the rhetoric grew harsher, it became clear that this was no ordinary political crisis. The machinery of war was beginning to turn, and there was no telling where it would stop. The world had been holding its breath, waiting for a spark. Now, with 2 gunshots on a quiet street in Sarajevo, the fuse had been lit, but the true explosion was still to come. And it would be far more devastating than anyone could have imagined. The domino effect, the assassination of Archduke Franz Ferdinand, was like a stone thrown into a still pond. But the ripples it created didn't just disturb the surface, they shattered the entire landscape of Europe. In the days and weeks that followed, a series of decisions, ultimatums, and secret telegrams set off a chain reaction that no one seemed able or willing to stop. What began as a local crisis in the Balkans quickly spiraled into a global catastrophe. As one nation after another was pulled into the vortex. In Vienna, the mood shifted from shock to cold calculation. The Austro-Hungarian leadership saw the assassination not just as a tragedy, but as a golden opportunity. For years, they had watched with growing alarm as nationalist movements threatened to tear their empire apart. Now, with the world's sympathy briefly on their side, they decided to act. But instead of seeking justice, they aimed for something much bigger. A chance to crush Serbia once and for all, and send a warning to every restless province within their borders. But there was a problem. Serbia was small, but it wasn't alone. Russia, the self-proclaimed protector of Slavic peoples, had long considered Serbia a kindred nation. Any attack on Serbia risked drawing in the Russian Empire, and with it, the possibility of a much larger war. Austria-Hungary's leaders hesitated until they received a message from Berlin. The German Kaiser, eager to prove his loyalty and perhaps to test his own military strength, offered Austria-Hungary a blank check of support. Whatever action Vienna chose to take, Germany would stand behind them. It was a promise that would have consequences far beyond what anyone in either capital could imagine. Armed with German backing, Austria-Hungary delivered an ultimatum to Serbia, list of demands, so harsh and sweeping that no sovereign nation could possibly accept them all. Some historians believe the demands were deliberately designed to be rejected, giving Austria-Hungary the excuse it needed to go to war. Serbia, desperate to avoid conflict but unwilling to surrender its independence, agreed to most of the terms but balked at a few key points. It wasn't enough. On July 28, 1914, Austria-Hungary declared war on Serbia, and the first domino fell. The response was immediate. Russia, bound by its ties to Serbia and eager to assert its influence in the Balkans, began to mobilize its vast army. Mobilization was more than just a show of force, it was a point of no return. Once the trains started rolling and the troops began to move, it was almost impossible to turn back. Germany, seeing Russian mobilization as a direct threat, issued its own ultimatum: stand down or face war. When Russia refused, Germany declared war on Russia. But the web of alliances didn't stop there. France, tied to Russia by a military alliance, now faced a terrible choice. If it abandoned its ally, it risked isolation and humiliation. If it joined the fight, it would be drawn into a war against Germany, a nation that had already humiliated France once before. The decision was made quickly. France began to mobilize, and Germany, anticipating a two-front war, put its long-standing military plans into action. Britain, meanwhile, watched the crisis unfold with growing alarm. Officially, Britain was not bound to fight unless France was attacked. But the invasion of neutral Belgium by German forces changed everything. The violation of Belgian neutrality was more than just a strategic move, it was a moral outrage, one that galvanized public opinion and gave the British government the justification it needed to enter the war. On August 4, 1914, Britain declared war on Germany, and the dominoes continued to fall. Within a matter of days, what had started as a regional dispute had become a world war. Montenegro joined Serbia, while Germany and Austria-Hungary stood together. The alliances that were supposed to keep the peace had instead ensured that no one could back down without losing face, or worse, losing everything. Each nation believed it was acting in self-defense, each convinced that the other side was the true aggressor. The machinery of war, once set in motion, was impossible to stop. And as the armies marched and the declarations of war piled up, ordinary people across Europe watched in disbelief. The newspapers were filled with patriotic slogans and promises of quick victory. But beneath the surface, there was a growing sense of dread. The world had stumbled into disaster, and there was no turning back. But as the first shots were fired and the borders crossed, few could have imagined just how brutal and how long this war would become. Germany's Blitz plan and Belgium's stand as Europe's great powers tumbled into war. Germany believed it held the winning hand. For years, German generals had been preparing for this very moment, convinced that victory depended on speed, precision, and overwhelming force. Their plan was bold, almost audacious, a lightning strike designed to knock France out of the war before Russia could fully mobilize its massive lumbering army in the east. This was the infamous Schlieffen Plan, a strategy that would become both legendary and infamous in the annals of military history. The logic was simple, at least on paper. Germany knew that fighting a war on two fronts against France in the west and Russia in the east would be a nightmare. So, the plan called for nearly the entire German army to swing through Belgium, bypassing the heavily fortified French-German border, and sweep down into northern France. The goal was to capture Paris in a matter of weeks, force France to surrender, and then rush the troops back east to deal with Russia. It was a plan that relied on speed, surprise, and the assumption that Belgium would offer little resistance. But there was a catch. Belgium was a neutral country, its independence guaranteed by international treaty. The German High Command hoped that the Belgians would simply step aside, allowing the German army to march through unopposed. After all, what chance did a small nation like Belgium have against the might of the Kaiser's forces? But the Belgians had other ideas. When German troops crossed the border in early August, they were met not with surrender, but with fierce resistance. Belgian soldiers, outnumbered and outgunned, fought with a determination that stunned the invaders. They blew up bridges, sabotaged railways, and turned every town and village into a battleground. The German advance, expected to be a swift and unstoppable tide, suddenly slowed to a crawl. Every day of Belgian resistance bought precious time for the French and British to mobilize their own forces. And as the fighting intensified, reports began to emerge of German troops committing atrocities against Belgian civilians, executions, the burning of villages, and the destruction of entire communities. Whether all these stories were true or exaggerated by the fog of war, they quickly became powerful weapons in the battle for public opinion. Across the English Channel, the British government seized on these reports, launching a propaganda campaign that painted Germany as a ruthless aggressor, trampling on the rights of small nations. Newspapers were filled with harrowing tales of Belgian suffering, and recruitment posters urged young men to join the fight against the Hun. The invasion of Belgium, more than any diplomatic treaty or secret alliance, galvanized British public opinion and made war seem not just necessary, but righteous. The world was watching, and the narrative was clear. Germany had crossed the line, and now it had to be stopped. But the consequences of Germany's decision to violate Belgian neutrality went far beyond headlines and speeches. The British Expeditionary Force, small but highly trained, landed in France and rushed to the front. Their arrival caught the Germans off guard, and in a series of fierce battles, the British and French managed to slow the German advance even further. The dream of a quick victory began to slip away, replaced by the grim reality of a long, grinding conflict. Inside Germany, the mood was shifting as well. The initial wave of patriotic fervor gave way to frustration and disbelief. As news of Belgian resistance and British intervention spread, the war that was supposed to be over by Christmas was already proving far more complicated and far more costly than anyone had imagined. And as the front lines bogged down, the world's attention turned to the suffering of civilians, the destruction of ancient cities, and the growing sense that something had gone terribly, irreversibly wrong. Yet, even as the German army pushed deeper into France, the seeds of a new kind of warfare were being sown. The old rules no longer applied, and the world was about to witness horrors on a scale no one could have predicted. The battle for Belgium was just the beginning, a warning of the darkness that was about to descend over Europe. But as the armies dug in and the front lines hardened, a new nightmare was about to begin, one that would redefine the very nature of war itself. The war mentality shattered as the armies of Europe collided, The old world met the new in the most violent way imaginable. For generations, war had been seen as a test of courage and honor, a grand contest where brightly dressed soldiers marched in neat lines, banners flying, and bands playing. Officers rode on horseback, swords gleaming, and the rules of engagement were as much about chivalry as they were about strategy. But in 1914, these romantic notions were about to be obliterated by the cold, mechanical reality of modern warfare. The first weeks of fighting were a brutal education. French soldiers, proud and confident, marched into battle wearing bright blue coats and vivid red trousers, uniforms that had barely changed since the days of Napoleon. They believed in the power of the offensive, convinced that sheer bravery and élan would carry the day. But the Germans, armed with the latest machine guns and heavy artillery, saw things differently. As the French advanced in tight columns, they were met with a storm of bullets and shells. The result was carnage on a scale that stunned even the most hardened veterans. The fields of northern France were soon littered with the dead and wounded, the bright colors of the uniforms making them easy targets in a world that had become a killing ground. It wasn't just the French who suffered. Every nation involved in the conflict brought with it the tactics and traditions of the previous century, only to find them hopelessly outdated. Cavalry charges, once the pride of every army, were cut to pieces by barbed wire and machine gun fire. Officers who tried to lead from the front found themselves just as vulnerable as the men they commanded. The thunder of artillery was constant, shaking the earth and shattering nerves. Soldiers who had enlisted expecting glory and adventure instead found themselves trapped in a nightmare of mud, blood, and terror. The generals, many of whom had spent their entire careers preparing for a different kind of war, struggled to adapt. Plans drawn up in peacetime quickly fell apart in the chaos of battle. Communications broke down, supply lines were stretched to the breaking point, and the sheer scale of the conflict overwhelmed even the most experienced commanders. Orders were often outdated by the time they reached the front, and entire units could be lost in the confusion. The myth of the quick, decisive victory evaporated almost overnight, replaced by a grim realization. This war would not be won by heroics or clever maneuvers, but by endurance and attrition. The psychological impact was devastating. Soldiers who survived the initial battles were left shell-shocked, haunted by the sights and sounds of modern combat, the relentless noise, the constant threat of death, and the sight of friends and comrades cut down in an instant left deep scars. Many would never fully recover, their minds as shattered as the landscapes they fought over. The term shell shock entered the vocabulary, a grim acknowledgement of the invisible wounds inflicted by this new kind of warfare. As the front lines stabilized, both sides began to dig in. Trenches, at first simple ditches scraped out of the earth, soon became vast networks stretching for hundreds of miles. Barbed wire, sandbags, and machine gun nests turned the Western Front into a fortress, impossible to cross without horrific losses. The war of movement gave way to a war of position, where gaining a few yards of ground could cost thousands of lives. The optimism of the early days was gone, replaced by a grim determination to survive back home. The reality of the war began to sink in. The newspapers, once filled with stories of heroism and quick victories, now reported lists of the dead and missing. Families waited anxiously for news, their hopes fading with each passing day. The governments of Europe, desperate to maintain morale, launched massive propaganda campaigns, urging their citizens to support the war effort and demonize the enemy. But beneath the surface, doubt and fear were growing. The old world was gone, swept away by the tide of industrialized slaughter. The war mentality had been shattered, replaced by a new and terrifying understanding of what modern conflict really meant. The leaders of Europe had unleashed forces they could no longer control, and the world would never be the same. But as the trenches deepened and the stalemate set in, an even darker chapter was about to begin, one that would test the limits of human endurance and reshape the course of history forever. Trench warfare. The nightmare begins with the war's early hopes of a quick victory dashed. The Western Front settled into a grim and unyielding stalemate. The armies, unable to outflank or overpower each other, began to dig in. What started as shallow ditches for cover soon evolved into a vast, interconnected labyrinth of trenches, stretching from the North Sea all the way to the Swiss border. This was the birth of trench warfare, a new and horrifying chapter in the history of conflict, where the battlefield became a living graveyard and every day was a struggle for survival. Life in the trenches was nothing like the glory-filled adventure many soldiers had imagined. The reality was a waking nightmare, a world of endless mud, filth, and fear. The trenches themselves were narrow, claustrophobic, and often flooded with icy water. After heavy rains, the ground would turn into a sucking, bottomless swamp, swallowing boots and sometimes entire men into the mire. The walls, reinforced with sandbags and wooden planks, offered little protection from the elements or the relentless shellfire that rained down day and night. The deadly expanse between opposing trenches, was a wasteland of shattered trees, barbed wire, and the twisted wreckage of war. Crossing it meant almost certain death. Artillery barrages would churn the earth into a moonscape of craters, and any movement above the parapet could draw a hail of machine gun fire. The constant threat of snipers, gas attacks, and sudden raids kept nerves frayed to the breaking point. Even the bravest soldiers lived in a state of perpetual tension, never knowing if the next moment would be their last. The psychological toll was immense. Soldiers endured not just the physical dangers, but the mental strain of constant bombardment and the ever-present stench of death. The term shell shock entered the language, describing the trembling hands, haunted eyes, and shattered minds of men who had seen too much. Some would break down completely, unable to speak or function, while others became numb, moving through the motions of survival with a hollow stare. Letters home tried to hide the worst of it, but the truth seeped through in stories of sleepless nights, lost friends, and the endless, grinding terror of the trenches. Disease was a constant companion. Rats the size of small dogs thrived in the filth, feeding on corpses and spreading sickness. Lice infested uniforms and bedding, causing relentless itching and spreading trench fever. The water was often contaminated, leading to outbreaks of dysentery and other illnesses. Frostbite and trench foot cost by standing for hours in cold. Wet conditions could turn a soldier's feet black and rotten, sometimes requiring amputation. The smell of decay, unwashed bodies, and chemical weapons hung heavy in the air, a reminder that death was never far away. Yet, even in this hellish environment, moments of humanity and resilience shone through. Soldiers shared jokes, songs, and stories to keep their spirits alive. They formed close bonds with their comrades, relying on each other for comfort and support. Small acts of kindness, a letter from home, a hot meal, a shared cigarette, became lifelines in a world gone mad. There were even rare moments of peace, like the famous Christmas truce of 1914, when enemies laid down their arms and met in no man's land to exchange gifts and play football, if only for a few hours. But these brief respites could not erase the overwhelming sense of futility and despair. The war had become a battle of attrition, with both sides pouring men and resources into the trenches in the hope of wearing the enemy down. Months of fighting might yield only a few hundred yards of ground, gained at the cost of thousands of lives. Commanders ordered attack after attack, sending waves of men over the top into the teeth of machine gun fire, only to see them cut down in their hundreds. The scale of the slaughter was almost unimaginable, and the survivors were left to wonder if there would ever be an end. As the years dragged on, the trenches became a symbol of the war's madness, a place where hope went to die, and the old world was buried beneath the mud. The men who endured it would never be the same, and the scars they carried would shape the world for generations to come. But even as the trenches claimed more lives and the war ground on with no end in sight, the world outside was beginning to change. New powers were watching, new weapons were being developed, and the conflict was about to spread far beyond the fields of France and Belgium. The nightmare of trench warfare was only the beginning. The true cost of the Great War was still to be revealed. The world watches and joins in while the trenches of Europe became a living nightmare. The rest of the world watched with a mix of horror, fascination, and uncertainty. The Great War, as it was quickly being called, was not just a European affair. Its shockwaves rippled across continents, drawing in countries and peoples who, at first, had only been distant spectators. The conflict was about to become truly global, and its consequences would reach far beyond the muddy battlefields of France and Belgium. In the United States, President Woodrow Wilson tried to keep his country out of the conflict. He spoke of peace without victory and urged Americans to remain neutral, hoping that reason and diplomacy could bring the fighting to an end. But neutrality was easier said than done. America was a nation of immigrants, and millions of its citizens had deep ties to the warring countries. German Americans, Irish Americans, British Americans, and others all watched the news from Europe. With personal stakes, their loyalties and emotions pulled in different directions. At first, many Americans saw the war as a distant tragedy, something terrible, but not their problem. But as reports of atrocities in Belgium spread, and as British propaganda painted Germany as a brutal aggressor, public opinion began to shift. The sinking of civilian ships by German U-boats, most infamously the Lusitania, sent shockwaves through American society. Suddenly, the war felt much closer to home. Rumors swirled about German spies and saboteurs operating on American soil, and the pressure on Wilson to take a stand grew stronger with each passing month. Meanwhile, the war's impact was being felt in every corner of the globe. The European empires called on their colonies for support, and millions of men from Africa, India, Australia, Canada, and beyond were drawn into the conflict. These soldiers fought and died in battles far from home, their sacrifices often overlooked in the grand narratives of the war. The war also disrupted global trade, causing shortages and economic turmoil from Buenos Aires to Shanghai. Neutral countries struggled to maintain their independence, caught between the demands of the warring powers and the realities of a world at war. Propaganda became a weapon as powerful as any rifle or cannon. Governments on all sides launched massive campaigns to sway public opinion, both at home and abroad. Posters, newspapers, films, and speeches urged citizens to support the war effort, buy bonds, conserve food, and enlist in the military. The lines between truth and fiction blurred, as rumors and half-truths spread like wildfire. In some cases, entire populations were whipped into a frenzy of patriotism, more paranoia, by stories that later turned out to be exaggerated or entirely false. The war also exposed deep divisions within societies. In Russia, the strain of the conflict fueled unrest and revolution, as soldiers and civilians alike grew weary of endless sacrifice and hardship. In Britain and France, labor strikes and protests erupted as workers demanded better conditions and an end to the bloodshed. In Germany and Austria-Hungary, food shortages and economic collapse led to growing discontent and calls for peace. The old order was crumbling, and new forces, socialist, nationalist, and revolutionary, were rising to take its place. As the war dragged on, its reach extended even further. The Ottoman Empire joined the Central Powers, opening new fronts in the Middle East and drawing in Arab, Armenian, and other peoples into the maelstrom. Japan, eager to expand its influence, sided with the Allies and seized German territories in Asia. Even countries in South America and Africa found themselves affected, as the global economy reeled and the demand for resources soared. By 1917, the world was teetering on the edge of even greater upheaval. The Russian Revolution toppled the Tsar and brought the Bolsheviks to power, promising peace but delivering more chaos. The United States, pushed to the breaking point by German submarine warfare and the infamous Zimmermann telegram and intercepted message, promising Mexico the return of lost territories if it joined the war against America, finally entered the conflict. American troops, fresh and full of hope, began to arrive in Europe, tipping the balance in favor of the Allies. The Great War had become a truly global conflict, reshaping borders, societies, and the very fabric of international relations. No corner of the world was untouched, and the old certainties had been swept away by the tide of violence and change. The world was watching, but now it was also fighting, suffering, and forever changed by the war that was supposed to end all wars. But as the guns thundered and empires crumbled, one question remained: what kind of world would emerge from the ashes of this unprecedented catastrophe? The answer would be more complicated and more haunting than anyone could have imagined. Conclusion: civilization unraveled as the guns finally fell silent and the smoke cleared over the scarred landscapes of Europe. The world found itself staring into the abyss left by the Great War. What had begun as a single act of violence in a distant city had spiraled into a conflict so vast, so destructive, that it shattered the very idea of what civilization meant. The world of 1914, so proud of its progress and sophistication, had been swept away in a tide of blood and mud. In its place stood a new reality, one marked by loss, disillusionment, and a haunting sense that something fundamental had been broken. The numbers alone were staggering. Millions of soldiers and civilians lay dead, entire generations lost to the trenches and battlefields. Cities that had once been centers of culture and commerce were reduced to rubble. The countryside, once green and fertile, was now a wasteland of craters, barbed wire, and unmarked graves. The psychological scars ran even deeper. Survivors returned, home changed forever, haunted by memories of horror and loss. Families mourned loved ones who would never return, and communities struggled to make sense of the devastation. But the true legacy of the war was not just in the numbers or the ruins. It was in the way it changed how people saw the world and themselves. The old certainties had been swept away. Faith in progress, in reason, in the inevitability of a better future, all had been shaken to the core. The war had exposed the fragility of civilization, the ease with which order could collapse into chaos, and the terrifying power of modern technology to destroy as well as create. The poets and artists who tried to capture the war's meaning found themselves lost for words. Their work filled with bitterness, irony, and despair. The political map of the world was redrawn almost overnight. Empires that had stood for centuries, Ottoman, Russian, and German, crumbled into dust, replaced by new nations and new uncertainties. The Treaty of Versailles, meant to bring peace, instead sowed the seeds of future conflict. Its harsh terms, breeding resentment and anger. The League of Nations, created in the hope of preventing another catastrophe, proved powerless in the face of rising extremism and the lingering wounds of war. Yet, even as the world struggled to rebuild, the lessons of the Great War were already being forgotten. The promises of never again rang hollow as old rivalries flared up and new ideologies took root. The economic turmoil of the post-years gave rise to political movements that would soon plunge the world into an even greater darkness. The war that was supposed to end all wars had, in many ways, only set the stage for the next act of tragedy. But perhaps the most haunting legacy of all was the realization that civilization is far more fragile than anyone had believed. The world of 1914 had seemed unshakable, modern, enlightened, and secure. Yet, in the space of a few short years, it had been torn apart by forces no one could control. The same technologies that had promised a new era of prosperity had been turned into instruments of mass destruction. The same ideals that had inspired progress had been twisted into justifications for violence and hatred. As we look back on the Great War, more than a century later, its echoes still shape our world. The borders drawn in its aftermath continue to spark conflict. The trauma experienced by its survivors lives on in the stories passed down through generations. The questions it raised about power, responsibility, and the limits of human reason remain as urgent as ever. So, what can we learn from the unraveling of civilization in 1914? Perhaps it is this, that peace and progress are never guaranteed, that the line between order and chaos is thinner than we like to believe, and that the choices of individuals and nations can change the course of history in ways no one can predict. The world of 1914 thought itself immune to disaster until disaster struck. The real lesson of the Great War is not just about the past, but about the dangers that still lurk beneath the surface of our own time. As you turn off this video and return to your own world, consider this: how quickly could everything we take for granted be swept away? And what would it take for us to recognize the warning signs before it's too late? The story of the Great War is not just history, a reminder and a warning for us all.